folks, welcome back to one of my wrap-up videos for my reading from 2021. Today I'm going to be doing my favorite nonfiction books of the year. I have a list of 13 books, and oddly enough, even though I tend to read a lot more nonfiction than fiction, I think I've got the stats written down somewhere. I think I read like 23% nonfiction. Anyway, oddly enough, it was much easier for me to come up with books for this list than it was for my fiction reads. Maybe it's because like nonfiction, it either sticks with me or it doesn't. And then fiction has more of a spectrum that's harder to draw that line of like what's the best of the best. But anyway, okay, I got 13 books to mention and hopefully not drag on too long. So let's get into it. First book on this list, of course, is Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmerer. This is a book I read, I think, like in March of this year, and it has definitely stuck with me. When I did my wrap-up for the month where I read this, I mentioned that, like, this was, like, the first time I encountered a book that I actually didn't want to read quickly. I was very intentionally only reading, like, a chapter or two a day, because it was, like, it was very comforting. Comforting in a way that still engaged with the world. So the tagline for this is Indigenous Wisdom, Scientific Knowledge, and the Teachings of Plants. So the author is an enrolled member of the Citizen Potawatomi Nation. But she is also a botanist, so she both has a history of traditional indigenous knowledge and also like modern scientific knowledge. And this book is like part memoir, part reflection on environmental justice, and also a reflection of the tension of like Western academic science and the way it tends to look down on indigenous knowledge and also knowledge that like didn't come out of a lab. And she very much demonstrates that so much of this knowledge is valid, and just because it doesn't have that like academic stamp of approval is not like appropriate grounds to disregard it. And I think this was one of the books that like really solidified that this is the type of memoir I like, where we are learning quite a bit about an author's life or an author's journey around a specific subject, but that's the jumping off point to learn about kind of that subject as a whole. It's not just microscopically focused on the person. It's kind of like how this person's experience fits into the broader issues at play in whatever they're talking about. And then also, like, this is one of the most beautiful books I have acquired this year. It's a hardcover with this wood print, and then like all the lettering is embossed. It's got a ribbon and it's lovely. The next book that has really stuck with me is not so comforting, definitely more rage-inducing, but also like one of the best written books I've read all year, and that is Evicted, Poverty and Profit in the American City by Matthew Desmond. And then I also listened to the audiobook for this, and the audiobook was fantastic. So Matthew Desmond is a sociologist who, over the course of like a year, very closely follows, how many families? He follows 8 families in Milwaukee as they each struggle to keep a roof over their heads. So he's following people who are living in trailer parks, people who are facing homelessness, people who are living in like slum apartments, and also following one family of landlords who are like small business landlords, where it's just like a small family very much trying to, you know, they're not part of like a land management company. They're not part, you know, they didn't inherit these properties. I mean, you do kind of see that they're not exactly the good guys, but you also see they are also kind of victim to the problem of housing should be a human right, but when you turn it into a business, it fucking falls apart. One of the stories that stuck with me was like a single mother who is, you know, calling apartments and like physically going to apartments to try and find a place that she can afford to live, and asking them like how much are they charging, and just like the lack of the presence of the internet in these families' lives, like showing how much labor goes into just keeping a roof over their heads. And you're like, well, can't you just like find out what it costs? You know, why can't you just like search for an apartment online? It's like, they don't have internet. They don't have a computer. They probably do not live, you know, they probably do not live walking distance from a library. They probably can't afford the bus fare to take the bus to the library to use their computers. And just like, this is like just one facet of like how expensive it is to be poor. It fills me with like a lot of rage, I think, also especially because like affordable housing is a big issue where I live in Seattle. It's a very, the cost of living here is very high, and that's a whole thing. But also I like that like towards the end the author also shows some things that are in play that could very much help with this issue. You know, things like universal basic income, of course, is a thing, but also things like having, or like, I don't remember where exactly he said was doing this, but there was one like eviction court that was assigning a tenant rights lawyer to the party facing eviction. Just giving them a lawyer, like just making sure everybody had access to a lawyer who could explain what their rights were to them, and also serve as a mediator between the tenant and the landlord, and just how many things were resolved by having access to legal counsel and legal guidance. It's very fascinating how this feels like a very microscopic view of this larger issue, and yet somehow it really shows the complexity of the affordable housing issue. So the next book I'm going to talk about, I believe, is the most recent read on this list. Yes. So that is In the Dream House by Carmen Maria Machado, and I also alternated between the physical book and the audiobook, which is narrated by the author. This is a memoir about the author's experience with an emotionally abusive relationship. And it's also a look at an abusive queer relationship, because the author was in a sapphic relationship. And, you know, initially she talks about how, the stories of domestic abuse are already such like a taboo thing. Like it's a very difficult thing to show that, you know, your relationship and your home life is not safe and not stable. And then there's the added facet of being queer, and like the added pressure to kind of portray yourself as being like these, you know, better than average people. And then like just the added complexities of, you know, showing an unhealthy relationship when you are part of a demographic where you struggle to have your relationships respected and validated in the first place. And then there's the added layer where how do I describe this? So the author is using kind of archetypal characters and themes from fairy tale and folklore within each chapter to kind of explore different parts of this relationship. Like, and it very much kind of put me in mind of the book Disfigured, that's like on fairy tales, disability, and making space, and the way that author drew a lot of like literary analysis of fairy tales and folk tales, and then put that with talking about disability representation in stories. There's something similar going on here with the analysis of these like repeated folktale stories of toxic relationships, basically, and the way that that's kind of like mirrored in her own relationship. So I really appreciate this like heavy literary analysis view of things, but I could see some people being like, that might be like one aspect too many. But I thought that it added like a very unique writing style to this memoir. And also like listening to it on audiobook, like it was just one of those stories where like what did I write? I wrote like a little Instagram review when I was in the middle of reading it. Hold on. Okay, so in my little Instagram post, I said, In the Dream House by Carmen Maria Machado is one of those books you start reading and the rest of the world stands still until you finish. You are haunted by it in every moment you are away from it. The entire time that I was reading this, I was kind of structuring my day around either listening to the audiobook or being able to sit down and actually read it. Because I couldn't really think about anything else until I was able to finish it. The next book I want to talk about is this graphic novel called This Place, 150 Years Retold. So this is an anthology of indigenous comic writers and artists taking kind of a re-examination of key historical events or themes from North American indigenous history. And it's a mix of stories from Canada and then some North American stories. And the very last chapter is definitely like a future speculative fiction story, and then there are a couple other stories that are like, they're not necessarily moment for moment based on historical fact, but they are representations of important cultural traditions and folklore and like ways of thinking and you know, things that might not be tangible name, date, place, fact, but are definitely like not fiction. They are real in their own way. And yeah, this was fascinating. It actually, is that on here? It is. So I guess I'll talk about this in conjunction with another book on this list, which is 400 Souls, a community history of African America, 1619 to, was it 2019? That sounds right. And so that book is an anthology of, each chapter is written by a different Black American author that kind of takes, they were like assigned like a 5-year period of American history, and they tell a story about Black people in America from that period of time. And either, you know, they're talking and they will talk about like a specific law or a specific person or a notable historical event or something. And it's not necessarily like a linear names, dates, places kind of thing. It is very much like a filling in of history. You know, this is the side of the story that you were not taught out of your high school American history textbook. They are both a filling in of history that has either been erased, attempted to be erased, or has been kind of glossed over or portrayed in a very different perspective. But also, so with 400 Souls, each chapter is a different Black American author, and then in the audiobook, each chapter has its own narrator. So like the amount of Black American talent in the project of 400 Souls is an amazing feat in and of itself, not to mention the content. And I think something very similar happens in here with the, you know, number of writers and illustrators who worked on this book. I guess just like how awesome it is to have these not just these books, but like these collaborative projects that showcase so much cultural excellence. The next book I don't have a copy of. I listened to the audiobook of Laziness Does Not Exist by Dr. Devon Price, who is a trans mask professor and social activist. I also follow them on Instagram. So Laziness Does Not Exist. More like Devon Price's work encapsulates a lot of things, but Laziness Does Not Exist kind of focuses on the kind of the cultural mindset that we as Americans and like in the Western world have about like a human being's value being tied to their ability to be productive, and like this constant pressure to always be working, always be ambitious, always be wanting more, always be doing. And when you are not doing all of the things that you're supposed to, then you are lazy, and laziness is bad, and it's a moral failing. So they kind of like, it's not a very, I think like the audiobook was only like 4 or 6 hours long. It was not very long at all. Maybe only like 8. And it only took me like 6 hours to get through it, something like that. So they kind of outline where some of these cultural philosophies came from. Excuse my phone. Talking about like some of the way that like religion has played a role. Some of the philosophies from the Puritans, who were like a major founding force in our society. And then also like the way capitalism specifically has encouraged this behavior, and really picking apart that like the expectation is unreasonable. Also, it's ableist, and also very much ties into sexism and racism. And I really did appreciate the way this author, even though they were very clear about what demographics they were a part of and were not a part of, they definitely, more than just like made an attempt, they definitely put the work into talking about this issue in an intersectional manner. And yeah, there's just it's a lot of social critique about like how exploitative a lot of our like labor practices are in this country, really challenging this kind of one-size-fits-all labor model. And then also there's very much like a call to action of like finding ways to challenge this overproductivity expectation, whether it's like unionizing or otherwise organizing with your coworkers to demand better working conditions, more reasonable working conditions. But then also like setting lots of boundaries, setting boundaries with social media, setting boundaries with like social activism, whether in person or in social media. Yeah, I feel like this is a book that would pair really well with How to Do Nothing, which is a book I want to read, but I haven't read yet. But the reviews I've seen around How to Do Nothing, I'm very intrigued by it, even more so after reading this book. And this author has another book coming out in the near future that I think focuses on autism, because they are also... Is it autism or is it neurodivergence? I'm unprepared, I'm sorry. But yes, I absolutely want to read that book, and I look forward to engaging with more work by Devon Price. Another book that I don't have a copy of. This one I borrowed from my library. This is, I didn't write down the tagline. It's by Thom. Let's see. I Hope We Choose Love, A Trans Girl's Notes from the End of the World. So this is it's a collection of essays and poetry by Thom, who she is a trans Chinese Canadian author, who is also, I think also has like some chronic illness at this point. and who's also like a very outspoken social activist, especially in queer trans communities that she's a part of. So the collection of essays focuses on just kind of reconciling with issues that affect the trans community, and especially trans women, and also kind of reflects on her work as a rights activist in these communities, and also like the concept. She's got a great essay kind of about, I don't think she ever uses the term woke culture, but it's definitely what it's talking about, like the way that liberal social justice areas, especially like on the internet, are very tone policing. They're very like, if you say the wrong word, we're like gonna cancel you, or we're gonna, make you trending on Twitter for the wrong thing, and you're gonna have to apologize for like everything. And she really kind of just wrestles with this idea of like, I'm not in, like, I need to get a physical copy of the book, because I think she takes inspiration from, I think, like another poem or song or something. And in her words, she's like, if I can't fuck up and learn from my mistakes, then it's not my revolution. If I can't bring my own friends, then it's not my revolution. If I can't bring my own family, it's not my revolution. And very much like critiquing the way that there's one way to be a good person or a woke person, just being like, no, like, we're human beings, we're flawed, like, we're gonna make mistakes. That's part of it, and it is irresponsible and dangerous to attack people to have this like mob ganging up on people when they show that they are not perfect. Like, what the fuck is that? Yeah, no, like, and her writing is also just really beautiful. She's got, I think, a couple of novels out too, that I would love to read. So this is definitely an author who's on my radar, and I would love to get a physical copy of this book. I don't think it wasn't very long, so this is one that I definitely want to reread. So next we've got another memoir. This is Dear Senthuran by Akwaeke Emezi, a Black Spirit memoir. I've read a couple of other things by Akwaeke Emezi. So Akwaeke Emezi is a non-binary Nigerian-born author who, the way that they describe their non-binary identity is they have multiple selves, and they're like made up of multiple godlike figures. Clearly I need to like read this shit again, because it's kind of hard for me to explain. It's kind of because I kind of struggle to feel like I'm explaining it well. Their non-binariness is more than just rejecting the male-female binary. It's, they feel like their identity is also like not strictly human. And it's just very interesting to hear them talk about that. But this is a memoir where they are writing letters, I believe, to their other selves and to friends, and it's talking about their experience of writing some of their other novels and writing this memoir, and the path of their success, especially with the publication of their first book, Freshwater. And it's fascinating. Like, their view of the world, their self-reflection is very interesting. There's a lot in here about suicide and suicide ideation, and actually I think this would pair very well with I Hope We Choose Love, because that one also has some very interesting reflections on suicide, and specifically the notion of how the idea of personal autonomy interacts with the possibility of suicide. Part of loving a whole person and respecting a whole person is understanding that their relationship with wanting to be alive is different than yours. I also really love Emezi's discussion of their relationship with fame and attention, because they describe themselves as someone who really likes being famous and likes being well known and likes a lot of attention, and takes a lot of pride and takes a lot of pride in it and like really feeds off of that energy. I feel like there's something in there that's kind of like, you know, why are men described as leaders but women are described as bossy? And I think there is some, again, like a weird false humility expectation that Emezi is just like, I don't fucking have time to conform to your weird human expectations. I am a god, and gods like to be worshipped, and that's part of why I have worked so hard to get to where I am, so that this is the life I want. Like, why would I lie about this being the life I want? Oh, and then also, like, I listened to the audiobook of this, which is narrated by the author, and it is also very good, and I would recommend it. Another book that's got to be on here is This Changes Everything by Naomi Klein. Let's see, this is Capitalism versus the Climate. So this is kind of a dense, thorough, investigative journalism book that looks at, like it says, capitalism versus climate change and environmental justice. She does a lot of investigating around legislation, around like fossil fuels and manufacturing and pollution, and kind of documenting the history of, you know, how these industries basically got to a point where they were writing the rules themselves about themselves, and like, what the fuck? Like, you can't police yourself. Like, that's not how the fuck it works, but that's what happened. Yeah, I feel this was definitely a book that, like, I had to, like, listen to on audio, because there's just a lot of information in it. It's definitely not the most easy reading thing on this list, but I feel like if you're someone who's at the point where, like, you know, like, what is happening with climate change, but you're wondering, like, how the fuck did we get here? Like, why haven't we made the changes we need to? Like, what's stopping us? Like, this is going to tell you, like, what's happening at, like, the legal and political level, and also, like, the economic level that is interfering with what the fuck we should actually be doing. Like, it'll fill you with a lot of rage and frustration, but she also does talk about, like, the on-the-ground grassroots organizations, especially things that are led by, like, indigenous communities around the world that actually have had some, like, legal wins and have gained some foothold, and they are the wall holding back the flood of what damage corporations would do to extract a buck from our environment. Very insightful, very enlightening, very frustrating. Next book that has to be on this list, Ace, What Asexuality Reveals About Desire, Society, and the Meaning of Sex by Angela Chen. So while this book does talk a lot about asexuality and, like, the various, you know, the various spectrums of asexuality, and it's not just a spectrum in one direction, what this book is really, what this book really is an examination of sexual expectations of our society. To kind of, like, put it in perspective, it's like, you know, there is such an expectation that, you know, you must want sex, and sex must be enjoyable, and if you don't want it or it's not enjoyable, then that is a problem to be fixed. And just case in point, like, look at look at how profitable something like Viagra has been, and how much research has been put into, like, a Viagra for women, and how rarely do you hear the conversation turn to, well, you know, maybe you not wanting sex is normal and not a bad thing, and is it really necessary? Like, maybe it's not something that needs to be fixed. Maybe it's just something the people around you need to be more understanding of. It'll make you really examine, like, your relationship with your friends, your relationship with, like, your own romantic partner, whether or not you want a romantic partner or need one. and also like the difference between like sexual attraction and intimacy and, you know, physical desire and emotional desire, and just like kind of breaking open all of these parts and very much saying that like all of these things are normal to somebody. And maybe, you know, your dissatisfaction with your intimate relationships has much less to do with you and more to do with what's expected of you. It's not even really pitched as like a book about relationships, but like if you're gonna read any kind of like relationship self-help book, I think like this is it. Because like while it does talk about like sexuality, it's definitely not just about sex. I mean, if I haven't already made it clear, any book that I'm talking about on this list that I don't own a physical copy of, I fucking need to. And I want to lend them to everybody, as long as that person gives it back. The next book that kind of just like lives rent-free in my head is Nomadland, Surviving America in the 21st Century by Jessica Bruder. And yes, this is the Nomadland that the movie is based on. I haven't seen the movie yet, but I would like to. So this is another investigative journalism thing that follows people who, you know, that follows modern nomadic people in North America. Basically people who are living in trailers, who are living in converted vans, who are living in their vehicles, and who basically are moving around the country pursuing seasonal work. And this book really focuses on the fact that this population is a lot of older Americans, particularly people who should be retired. And there was definitely a boom of, you know, people of retiree age continuing or returning to the workforce after like the last big economic crash. And basically it kind of examines that like the American dream of work hard, save your money, and enjoy your retirement is very much a lie for so many people. And I think this book came out kind of just before, you know, hashtag van life became trendy with a younger generation, especially on social media. So it really doesn't look at younger people. Like you encounter a couple of them in there, but this is really focusing on a generation of people who can't really afford to retire, and are pursuing the jobs that will take them, or are pursuing the jobs that are accommodating to living nomadically. There's a lot in here about Amazon warehouses, so if you were very interested in the nature of working in an Amazon warehouse, or a lot of like worker experiences, worker exploitation, all that kind of stuff, like there is a lot in here about that. But there's also a lot in here about the amazing community that these people form, the way that they are very supportive and helpful of each other, the way that some people kind of fall into this life, you know, because of hard circumstances, but then they kind of discover like, oh my God, there's so much freedom in discovering that there is an alternative way to survive and thrive beyond, you know, grow up, get married, work until you retire, and then hopefully you have enough money to enjoy the rest of your life before you die. That there's just more options to having a fulfilling, successful life beyond what the American dream has, you know, sketched out for us. Last two books, we can do it. All right, next book on this list is Empire of Pain. This has definitely been a popular one on BookTube. This is a book that chronicles the life of the Sackler family, who are famous for being the family that owned Purdue Pharma, that invented and manufactured OxyContin, and greatly contributed to the opioid crisis. And then this book came out when the family was still I don't think like all the final dust has settled from the legal battles around the family, but basically like trying to sue the family, not just the company, for their role in the opioid crisis. It lays out like a lot of evidence, a lot of interviews and, you know, written testimonies, vocal testimonies, like factual evidence that definitely builds the case that the family knew how effective this drug was, how addicting this drug was, and definitely chose to downplay the risks of it, and then chose to really manipulate the narrative around like their role in it, and then like the company's role in it. It's wild and infuriating, and but also fascinating. Also, one of the initial tidbits is like documenting the rise of advertising for pharmaceuticals, because like initially that like you know, now like you open a magazine and there's like an ad for, you know, talk to your doctor about this drug, talk to your doctor about that drug, and that like didn't used to be a thing. Like there would be like sales representatives that would go and talk to doctors, that would go and talk to trained medical professionals about you know, here's this new drug, here, you know, this might be good for this thing or that kind of patient or something. But like the idea of like marketing a pharmaceutical to the masses and having them create a demand for new pharmaceuticals, like that was a whole choice. Which, you know, at the time, maybe you wouldn't really have been able to see the long-term consequences of it, you know, 50 years later. But it's just an interesting idea to think about. And I also listened to the audiobook for this, like I do with most of my nonfiction, and the audiobook was also great. The last book I listened to, of course, audiobook, this is Care Work, Dreaming Disability Justice by Leah, Lakshmi, Piepzna-Samarasinha. Did I remember her name? I will have the names of all the authors in the description box below for your reference and ability to correct me. So this is a book about disability justice. It's a series of letters, essays, you know, political call to actions, or just like self-reflections from this disabled writer who is also a person of color and queer. And she's kind of taking, you know, so she's a queer POC disabled activist. And she's, you know, talking from that lens about, you know, social change and social revolution, and, you know, how do we make a more just and equitable world? And basically making the argument that, like, you know, disabled people, they know what needs to happen, and they have a lot of knowledge that anybody who has any interest in social justice, whether it's like racial justice or, you know, economic justice or child welfare or, you know, environmental justice, like all of these things, like we have so much that we can learn from the type of activism that is present in the disability community, and especially regarding like protecting yourself from burnout, and or being able to recover from burnout, and how to stay engaged in something that is a lot of work, that is a lifetime of work, and can be very draining and very frustrating. And yeah, it was, this is another, again, I need to get a physical copy, because this is something that I feel like, you know, philosophically, I really want to go back to these ideas and engage with them and find ways to apply them to things that are happening in my own life, in my own workplace. She does have an essay in Disability Visibility. Her essay is called Still Dreaming While Disability Justice Dreams at the End of the World, by Leah, Lakshmi, Piepzna-Samarasinha. If you're going to be engaging with disability justice narratives, she is absolutely a name to know and a name to watch. So, great. Okay, there we go. Only an hour 10 footage. No big deal. Okay, I hoped this would be a much shorter video. but I love talking about books. So, I mean, that's why I have a booktube channel. You know, I hope you have enjoyed this at least half as much as I have enjoyed talking about these books. I hope you have a good rest of your day. I encourage you to go out into the world and be curious. I will have my social media and other places where you can find me in the description box below. And I will catch you folks in my next video. Bye! Come on, human body, chill out. I say that as if I have options of a non-human body. You know, chastised for like being chastised for scrolling on Facebook. There's a lot of dates, there's a lot of like there's a lot.